Hello, I'm Nathalie Goldstein, enrolled agent and CEO of MyExpatTaxes. Today we're going to look at the most common IRS notices that expats receive. The first notice is normally a request for additional information. And while this can come into different flavors, so to say, you'll normally see it being called Letter 12C. So this letter is, as it's called, a request for additional information, and it will normally ask you to give additional information about certain schedules or forms that are included in your US tax return. For example, say you're using the foreign earned income exclusion and you have a negative amount for other income, and on your form, Schedule 1 for the foreign earned income exclusion amount. But hey, guess what? Perhaps you forgot to include Schedule 2555, or it was mailed and the IRS lost that form, which is very common. That if you paper mail return, they will actually lose forms and schedules and pages. That's not the point. All it's asking is for you to send in that schedule again. So you just have to paper mail in what they asked for. So it's something that you read carefully and you go, okay, what is the IRS asking for me? Are they asking for a Schedule C that's filled out? Are they asking for Form 2555? Are they asking for a Schedule B? Whatever they ask for, you normally would just fill out that schedule or form. You would just include that filled out form in a paper mailed response to the IRS. There are sometimes options to fax that information, but you do need a fax machine, of course, for that. The next notice you get is a little bit scarier. It's a notice of tax due, normally on CP 14. So a notice of tax due will normally say, this is what you submitted to the IRS. This is what they calculated on their side. Sometimes there are adjustments to the calculations, sometimes there are not. And it will say, based on what they calculated, this is how much tax you owe. And now that you haven't paid it, this is how much interest or penalties that can be included. And so basically, when you see a notice like that, the first thing to go is, what did you submit? What were your calculations versus the IRS's calculations? Of course, if you're working with MyExpatTaxes, you would normally just send this notice over to your tax professional and they'll look at everything for you. If you're doing this on your own or you're doing this with another tax software or firm that has no post-filing support, then you're looking at that column, your calculations versus IRS calculations. And then from there, if the calculations are the same, and it just says that you owe tax and maybe you forgot to pay the tax or you thought the tax was paid but it actually didn't go through, you would just pay the tax due. Now, if there are adjustments and you don't agree with those adjustments, then that's different. You probably would look to respond and file an amended return or to call the IRS directly and say, actually, your calculations are not correct because of X, Y, and Z. The next level to these notices is normally a notice of deficiency, and this is on 3219. So if they had sent you the original letter to say tax was due, and maybe this didn't arrive to your international location, maybe you saw it and you forgot about it, who knows? If you reach the time frame on that and they don't hear anything from you, and they don't get your payment, they will send you this notice of deficiency. And this gets a lot more serious because this basically says, hey, you have to pay this amount and you have to pay it by this certain time. And if you don't agree, it's no longer going to the IRS directly, but you would be appealing in front of the US tax court. That sounds quite formal and scary. It's rarely ever so serious. It's something normally you can figure out how to handle with an IRS call, and then they'll tell you the steps to take from there. However, of course, it's best that you don't get to this position, right? Obviously, if you pay the notice of deficiency, it would close itself. But it's one of those where you normally want to deal with this at the notice level before of just notice of tax due. So the next notice is not necessarily a notice with a notice number itself, but a letter from the IRS saying that your income that you reported just doesn't really match their records. This normally happens if you have still a lot of US source income. So if you're getting Form 1099, W-2s, K-1s, etc. So basically the IRS has a record of the information and income that they think that you got. but that doesn't match with what you submitted on your tax return. We normally see this when people have either maybe some online sales through Airbnb or Amazon or PayPal, etc., because those institutions will issue a 1099-K to the IRS. However, what they issue is the gross transactions, and maybe what you're reporting is what you actually got from those platforms and not the gross transaction. So this can be a mismatch. So what you normally do is you would just make an amendment to say, oh, my Schedule C will report the gross amount, and then you'll then subtract out the commissions as fees or expenses. Another situation can be if you have stock sales and you get a 1099-B form, and maybe because those forms can be a little bit confusing, you didn't report exactly how the IRS had expected you to report. So again, normally these situations, you'll just file an amendment. And it does happen that you miss US income because again, you're living abroad, you might not get all those 1099 forms to your address. The most important thing is just if you get this notice that you file an amendment so that your return matches what the IRS believes that you should have, so that they won't then try to issue you a notice of tax due. So another notice, and the final notice we'll talk about, is a notice of estimated tax penalties. So again, while this is not a specific notice, this notice will normally tell you, hey, you actually owe more penalties than maybe you thought. Because if you owe over $1,000 in US tax, you're not only expected to pay that tax by April 15th to prevent penalties and interest from accruing, you're also expected to pay quarterly estimated payments. So if you don't make those quarterly payments in advance, the IRS can impose this estimated tax penalty, and there's really nothing you can do about it. So it's one of those things where you have to understand when you're filing a tax return, and if you owe taxes, what do you have to do in terms of your next year's tax returns? Again, this only applies for those that owe over $1,000 US, but if that's you, always make sure that you're paying your current year's taxes, but you also look out to make your quarterly estimated tax payments for the following year. And when you're using a software like MyExpatTaxes, we'll actually always give you a schedule, no matter how many taxes you owe, about what quarterly payments you are recommended to make. If this video helped you, make sure to subscribe for more tips for expats by expats.